And will you thank you for everyone for joining us. We've had a little technical difficulty today. Is everybody able to see my screen that has increasing diversity and nonprofit board development?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, perfect. Well, Dr. Lee, if you'll help facilitate, if we have any questions or chat as we go through, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I don't want to delay us anymore, but just want to introduce myself. My name is Susan Nichols. I'm out of Houston, Texas. I've been in nonprofit for 32 years. 11 of those years have been consulting. I just want to So here is, if you want to scan this real quick and join me on LinkedIn or connect with me on LinkedIn, that would be great. I wanted to offer that up front. So as we're going through this, you will see more about me. So like I said, I am in nonprofit. I've dedicated my whole educational, academic, and professional life to nonprofit work. And it was a natural progress for me to go from getting my master's. I am in nonprofit. I'm in the faith-based and non-faith-based space, but I have a master's in theology, and my doctorate is in something called transformational leadership, with a focus in transformation within cultures, and that is both in ethnic cultures and corporate cultures. So that is kind of the context. For me, it was a natural progression to get my certification as a diversity executive, simply because I believe in nonprofit work. Our primary focus is to provide equity and resources and tools for everyone. And I felt like that was working a lot with minority people groups and people of color and different groups with different disabilities. That was just a natural, very natural fit for me. So here's my context. I have been exposed to geographic disparities. I have been in national and global cohorts studying nonprofit practices over the years. Specifically, I spent a very concentrated time of 3 years traveling the United States, looking at best nonprofit practices in at-risk, high at-risk communities. So social, economic, and educational disparities. I myself was transitionally homeless for a period of time growing up in my teenage years, and found myself in the foster care system for several of those years. And so had a firsthand experience really within the systems that I currently work with. Cultural disparities. My best friend of 45 years is Jamaican, and I have served in leadership in a multicultural church representing 14 different countries. And it was a rather closely knit church. So, dealing with various culture groups, some of which within their own countries, they were in rival tribal cultures, and navigating the process of how to create unification around those issues was at top of mind at all times. And then healthcare disparities. I am a leukemia patient with hidden disabilities. I have been battling the medical system and battling with severe effects from leukemia over the past 11 years, actually. And so I'm 11 years in remission, but for me, that means that my leukemia is going to come back. It's a matter of time. And so just navigating the healthcare system has been, so I just wanted to give you my context of the different areas and forms of diversity that I've walked through myself and been exposed to. And then racial disparities. I have my husband and I have a bonus son, Josh. We consider him like a child to us. He became a part of our family when he was 18. And so raising and being a part of and learning from an African American male that was within our family unit and considered family and treated as family has really brought some perspective to this subject. So in our time together, I want to give statistics. And the reason why I do that is I base everything I do off of research. I find that is an easy lead-in and form for change. If you want any kind of change, you have to show where the disparities lie. And it has to kind of click with people on an intellectual level. Then I want to share a professional framework of which I developed. I worked within a framework, particularly in my doctoral, my dissertation, and it provided a framework that might be helpful when you're trying to diversify your board and nonprofit. And then I want to talk about ways to implement diversity for board structures, and then ways to implement diversity into actual board practices. And then we'll have a time of Q&A. Now, that doesn't mean throughout this, if you have a question and want to send that in, Dr. Lee will take a look at those, and if need be, interrupt at any time. If you send something to him in the chat that we can go over, and there will be a few survey questions throughout that I'll want some feedback on as well. Okay, so I am from Houston. And the reason why I want to give you this context is most people don't realize this about Houston. It's been a blessing, and it's been interesting to navigate diversity within the city of Houston. And there's several reasons why. We are the third largest city in the US, behind New York, LA. Chicago and Houston go back and forth between being third and fourth, depending on whether you include the metro area of Houston. Most people don't realize how large we are. And according to what we call the Anthropy Index, we are the most diverse city in the United States. That means we are the closest to being a fourth white, a fourth Black, a fourth Hispanic, and a fourth Asian. In fact, we have a county called Fort Bend County that is the most diverse county in the United States. And the reason why this has been important to me is Rice University, which is a very prestigious university located here in Houston. Their social psychology department has studied the city of Houston for over 40 years, and very much within the nonprofit realm, within city planning, how that impacts the city. So it's a very rich environment. In fact, Stephen Kleinberg, who was the head of that department, said Houston is a laboratory for the rest of the US. So he has written this book here. If you are interested in knowing where most cities are heading, he has written a book called Houston on the Cusp of Changing America, the Prophetic City. And we are considered 40 years ahead with how we're handling city growth and diversification. So it would be an interesting read for those of y'all that want to learn a little bit more about how diversification impacts city structures itself. Okay, first question I want to ask, and Dr. Lee, maybe you can give me the answer to this on the responses to the chat, is do you serve on a board? Let's see. Okay, perfect. Glad to know that y'all are. Thank you for your service. And Latanya, not currently, but hopefully this will give you insights to on-roads, to maybe being in that capacity. So I appreciate your feedback on that. And my next question I want to ask then is, for those of you that do serve on a board, are you a person of color? Okay. Okay, so hopefully this will give insight to people of color and people not of color. It will hopefully open your eyes to how you can advocate for diversity if you're not of color, and how to integrate into the and create more diversity if you're a person of color? And this is the last question. If you're on a board, is your board diverse? Do you have strong diversity plans and or implementation on your board? Okay. Okay. Great. Okay, so hopefully through this, you'll be able to gain insight of how to, again, increase diversity, and if and not lose heart in that process. Let me just start by saying boards do not seek me out to diversify their boards. I have figured out ways to communicate to when I start bringing up the issue of diversity, and I do very bluntly, that seems like a natural process that needs to happen. And I'm going to walk you through some of that. So I have found for me, because diversity, particularly right now, can be so controversial and so misconceived, especially in the nonprofit world, where there are such strong influences and opinions and funding around that issue. I am going to hopefully walk you through methods and ways in which that subject can be broached, addressed very clearly, with minimizing and mitigating any heightened response to that, and or when there is, how to work through that in such a way that it's very clear that it's best for the organization. So let me share some current statistics with you that we know. This is from Leading with Intent. Board Source is a great resource that I use that comes out with a study, their last one being in 2021, specifically on DEI practices within nonprofits, right? So if you would like to get your hands on that, I would write this down as a resource. I'll refer to it later as well. It's a wonderful resource with very clear statistical information of where our nonprofits stand for those that participated in the study. So 87% of nonprofit chief executives are white, right? You'll even see this on a broader scale if you were to look at the chief executives for Fortune 500s, right? We have a very small percentage of people of color that are chief executives on our nonprofit boards. 77% of board chairs are currently white. 78% of nonprofit board members are white as a whole. That means we're highly underrepresented with people of color. And by the way, I'm really focusing on ethnicity and color, but I want you to know that this can also apply to other nonprofits that focus on other issues, such as ADA or foster children, or different clientele that address other issues that lack representations in nonprofits. Then 19% of boards are entirely white. Okay, so I find that having these basic stats on hand are very eye-opening to a lot of people that maybe are not in the minority setting. When I share these, it gives validation to opening up the conversation. And that's the first step to really making any progress on your nonprofit board, is to open up that conversation. So this is also from Leading with Intent. These are board stats that are a little clearer in that. Boards are far from representing the communities they serve. Only 38% of executives and 29% of board chairs felt like their board represented the communities they served. Well, we can obviously see why this would be a problem, but this is also an area to leverage. Look, if we're representing who we say we're serving, if we are going to reach the people group we say we serve, we have to have connections and representation of that people group as part of our board. 66% of executives and 45% of board chairs expressed dissatisfactions with the board's racial and ethnicity diversity. Board recruitment. Now, this kind of gets into the recruitment practices because, of course, if your board's not diverse, the way you're going to get diversity is through your recruitment practices. Board recruitment practices are not aligned with diversity goals. Demographic diversity is a high priority for only 46% of boards. 30% reported as low or not a priority at all, and only half have aligned their board recruitment practices with the diversity goals in general. And then boards that include people of color are more likely to have adopted DEI practices than boards that do not include people of color. Executive and board chairs report significantly lower levels of engagement in areas that extend beyond the initial phases of understanding and apply directly to the organization's mission, work, and the community it serves. That seems very obvious to us. But sharing this information, I find connecting the dots a lot of times for people, believe it or not. I find it highly disturbing how ill-informed and ill-educated some board members are just about diversity in general. And again, bringing up some of these stats really opens the door to having that conversation. So I think the first question you need to ask for your nonprofit or any nonprofit you're working with or thinking about is, what are our stats? What are your stats? It is a good practice to look at your board makeup, your community makeup, the makeup of your nonprofit sector, and the makeup of your client base. If you can show the disparity between your board makeup and what's in your community, what's in the sector of your nonprofit, and what your client base is, that is a good, solid foundation to start addressing these issues in such a way that could be more engaging for people to and palatable for people to grasp and understand. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about professional framework and the difference between cross-cultural and intercultural communication. This is a basic understanding when it comes to cultural communication. And that is, cross-cultural communication is one culture is considered the norm and all other cultural cultures compared to or contrasted to that dominant culture. That is not what we want to work towards. We want to work towards intercultural communication, which is a deep understanding and respect for all cultures, mutual exchange of ideas and norms. No one person or culture is left unchanged. It's a more healthy dialogue between the two. In studies I found in my study, that can't happen with just one or two representatives on a board or within the organization. You have to literally have a starting place where you open the door to multiple people of a different culture or different culture groups being represented for you to reach this intercultural communication level, right? There has to be some leverage of actual representation that takes place. Now, professional framework. This is based on intercultural competence. So how do we get to a point where people are interculturally competent? I know right now this slide doesn't seem like it maybe has a lot to do with board development, but I'm going to get to that in just a minute. In a person's intercultural development, intercultural competence is the overarching objective. That's what you want to get to. But you have to start with intercultural sensitivity. That you have to increase people's sensitivity and reflected in their maturity, because then they can start using intercultural communication skills. So you have to you have to, and I'll share ways and methods to open that sensitivity later in this presentation that's board specific, but you have to open the sensitivity for people to gain those intercultural communication skills to even become interculturally competent. I can especially say that just being a white woman through my development of diversity and understanding of diversity, I've had to increase my level of sensitivity and listen in order to understand better communication skills to be more competent in my communication with different people groups. Okay, so this is a very great, man, I've used this slide for years over and over and fine-tuned it because I find that this diffuses a lot of thoughts about how do we address racism? How do we address injustices? How do we address just racism in general? And so I always talk to nonprofits. You see this lens here called the common good lens? I tell every nonprofit leader that is the lens you're aiming to work through, to look through. That is your vision and mission of your organization, right? Everybody has a different personal mindset and cultural mindset. Your personal mindset is all your personal experiences you've gone through, your different perspectives you have on your personal life. Cultural mindset is culture groups you've grown up in, whether it be religion, your family unit, the city in which you live. Those have all different cultural perspectives. And that, when you have different cultural perspectives, those are based on you can be flexible in your methodology and how you reach those groups. So many people feel like if they're looking at a common good, that they're sacrificing their cultural and personal mindset. You're not. You're just saying, look, these are my experiences personally and culturally that I need you to understand and have a decent understanding of. But we are all working towards this common good goal within our nonprofit, which, if you have a strong vision and mission statement, would be the real focus for what that common good goal is. Okay, so this is when you ask the question, all nonprofits, and I'm fixing to explain this a little more in detail according to board structure. But the number one question that should always be asked by a nonprofit is, what is in the best interest of the organization? Meaning, does everything we do align with our mission, vision, and core values? Right? If we can say that we have alignment and
Dr. Nichols, you lost your audio. Dr. Nichols. I don't think something. She's having some. Hold on one second. Dr. Nichols, can you hear me?
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for that, Dr. Lee. Okay, so these are the three and a lot of boards don't even know the information I'm sharing with you. And why it's important you get equipped with this is when you go in with the upper hand of understanding how a board should function, it gives you credence moving forward and addressing some of all the other issues. Okay, so governance. Governance is oversight and accountability of the board. So the board is to govern itself and it has oversight and accountability. Here are some of the ways you can do that. Under governing and nominates, should be the board should have committees, right? I recommend these three being your best practice is these three committees: governance, financial, and development committee. 75% of nonprofits have governance and development committee, and I think about 91% have a financial committee. But that's best practice to have these three committees. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So governance and nominating committee, having one in place is so important to really starting, because the nominating is where you're doing board recruiting. So making sure that your board has a governance and nominating committee. Officer and board job descriptions needs to be very clear. This is also where you can put a disclosure statement about hiring practices. Again, job descriptions, because board members are non-paid employees. They should be treated like employees when it comes to onboarding orientation. We'll get to that in a minute. And having a clear job description for your officers and general board members. Employee manual. That's another way to make sure that things are very clearly outlined in your board manual about what your organizational practices are going to be. Approval of policies and procedures and guidelines. That is done under your governance committee. That is their responsibility to approve board policies, procedures, and guidelines. And that is a great area to make sure that you are including equitable practices. And then your onboarding process. Like I said, when you're doing an orientation or onboarding of a board member, this is a great way to set the tone for how things will be handled within your nonprofit. And then annual board evaluation. Each board should be evaluating itself, its executive director, and its board chair every single year. And then an annual board retreat. This is a great way to build builds unity within the board and exposure to each other outside of a boardroom setting where you're really giving opportunity to discuss issues that may come up that are really might be controversial or hard to do in a different setting. You can leverage on your board retreat time how to address these issues and do it in a productive way, whether it's bringing an outside consultant in or someone to facilitate or someone that's good in relationship development and or personality profiles, etc. Okay, then financial and budget oversight. And think of this in ways of diversifying things that happen within your budget, such as finance committee. You should have a finance committee in place. Financial review or audit. This may be even seeking out a audit agency that's headed by a person of color, or having the person that does your audit. This is making sure that you diversify and have accountability, because these numbers, you don't realize it, but you can leverage your numbers to talk about ways in which you need to diversify your organization. And if you have a good financial review or audit, it will show those gaps. Donor Bill of Rights. So making sure your organization has a donor bill of rights in place. And basically what that's saying is that the people that donate to you have rights within the organization. It's kind of like when you go to a hospital and you have patient rights. So this is a way of saying, look, we have to meet the needs of our donor base, meet the needs of our community, because that is a fiduciary responsibility we're giving, that we're saying that we do for our donors. Amount to contribute to the organization. All board members need to be contributing members. We'll talk about how to make that a little more equitable in a minute, but each board member should be contributing financially. It's one of the first things that's asked on a grant application. Are all your board members giving, and what percentage are they giving? Okay, and then under development, when I say development committee, I am talking about the strategic framework for programming and funding. So the development committee's role is making sure they're funding the organization, but also how are they developing the programs that help meet the needs and the strategic plan of the organization. Contributors to the organization, meaning we can really diversify with who's contributing to the organization, having different groups that we target and look at who are participants in the makeup of the organization. Strategic plan, being very clear on your strategic plan of what is your DEI strategy. What are those things within your strategic plan that are going to help you better meet the needs of who you're serving in your community and align you with your mission and vision? Okay. For whatever reason, it's not advancing. Okay, steering committees. You can also put steering committees under your development committee. And that's like if you have a gala committee or a fundraising committee. This is a great way to integrate people that may not be represented on your board, because on steering committees, they don't necessarily have to be board members. This is a great way to onboard new people that you think would be a good fit into your nonprofit that may be underrepresented. Okay, and then program development process, exactly that. Thinking about how to develop your programs and who can be involved in that process that's a better representation of who you serve and who you are as an organization. Now, most nonprofits do not understand that they are legally liable for their organization. This is why you have directors and officers insurance. Your executive director, the worst that's going to happen to your CEO or executive director is that they get fired. A nonprofit board member or the board in general can be sued, and you have directors and officers insurance to protect you from that. But I tell board members this because a lot of times they don't realize the gravity. They're joining a board because they think it would look good on their resume, or they've been told that they only have to show up to meetings and make votes. And it's really much more serious than that. And when they understand the seriousness, then they understand the importance of connecting the dots to becoming more diverse. So you have, hold on just a moment. I'm not advancing for some reason. Okay, so this is why you have directors and officers insurance. This is why you do a letter of intent every year with board members. And a letter of intent could include the intent to make connections for board members. And that opens up the door to bringing in board members that are underrepresented. This is when you tell people you're making decisions on behalf of the organization. Again, not your personal preference, not your personal opinion. We have to make decisions on behalf of the organization. And if our mission and vision is clear about reaching the people we say we're going to reach, that automatically implies diversification. Do what is best for those you serve, meaning you want to do what's best for the people you're serving. You don't want to relieve your feelings of guilt of not best serving a community, or even your savior complex about being a savior for a community. You want to walk along a side of a community, meaning you're not doing things to them or for them, you're doing things with them. And that's a totally different mind shift when we talk about duty of care. And then know who you serve. Again, knowing the stats and the trends of who you're serving is really going to be a connector for what to do differently within the organization. Okay, duty of loyalty. This is when you have to set aside your personal and professional interest. This comes into play when maybe you have people serve on your board that have a special skill set or background, but you're telling them that their loyalty is to the organization, not to their profession first, but to their organization, and how can they utilize their profession to advance the mission of the organization. So that's why you have conflict of interest agreements that are clear on that. And these are all, again, I know that may sound like minutia, but these are all things that prevent discrimination practices being integrated into how you do business as a board. Conflict resolution policy. If a conflict comes up, how is it going to be resolved, and what is going to be our policy around resolving that? Doing what's in the best interest of the organization. So not only are you doing what's in the best interest of the people you serve, but the organization itself. And then who might be recused from a meeting? If you have an issue that is heightened and there's a conflict of interest, then that requires someone being recused from a meeting. Now, let me be very clear on this, because a lot of boards that I've seen use this to skirt out minority voices on the board, whether it be a person that's of minority or minority opinion. You never, ever can recuse an executive director or CEO from a meeting unless it's about salary increase or discipline issues. And even then, they should know what that meeting is about, why they're being recused, right? So it's never allowed to isolate the executive director from the fullness of what's happening in the organization. Again, the only reason for that is discipline, salary increase, and audit. That is the other thing. So you have a very just audit that's not heavily weighed by any one person in the organization. Okay, duty of obedience is being true to the mission and vision, and also having legal compliance. This is when you have to have a good understanding of what's legally allowed and not allowed in your organization, which is usually meaning you operate within your bylaws and articles of incorporation. And again, this may not seem like it has a lot to do with the end result of diversification, and we'll get to more specifics later. But if people are not operating by your bylaws, you should be reviewing them every 3 to 5 years. That gives a window for people that get on tangents to lead with a false narrative or with false presumptions about what they're allowed and not allowed to do within a board. Operate within federal and state guidelines. That carries the same weight. A whistleblower policy. There needs to be a clear understanding if issues come up about diversity and issues that come up with prejudices or discrimination, how that's going to be dealt with through a whistleblower policy. Okay, and now I want to get on to board structure, because this is giving you an overall structure. All boards should have committees. And we talked about those 3 minimal committees to have, and that's committees to deal with the strategic area of the organization. An advisory council. it's so underutilized how many nonprofits have advisory councils. But those are people with either specialized time or money, or specialized expertise, or not at a place at that time to be a part of a board. But it is a great way to bring people into the fold of the organization and prep them to be on the board. So usually what I suggest is like committees need to be chaired by a board member, but depending on who is appointed to that committee, it could be non-board members on a committee, but advisory council are non-board members. They are not voting, they're a council. They have no voting rights, but it gives freedom in a way to kind of bring people on board to see how they would be a fit in an organization. But it is a great way to bring on the less represented people groups for them to ease their way onto a seat on the board. And then a task force. Your board may say, we need a task force, and task forces are usually very broad. This is a great way to pick a much broader scale of community representation to address a certain need in your board. Like if you're doing a bylaw review, or if you're doing a survey if you need to look at what it is to pilot a new program. The board might put together a task force where you could bring in underrepresented groups to be a part of that task force. So constituents and stakeholders can serve on committees, and the advisory council are a task force that eventually get voted onto the board. So again, this is a great avenue to not, in a non-threatening way, to really introduce diversity onto your board. Then committees, task force, and advisory council need to be chaired by board members. And that's really, boy, it's really great when you have, I work with several boards right now that do have people of color as the CEO and or executive director and the board chair. And that is a great way to really expand the representation within your organization. Now, remember, if you have an executive committee, executive committee can speak to or for your board. That's where you want to make sure, because executive committees are usually made up of all your officers and the executive director. Boy, that's why it's important to get underrepresented people groups within the officer positions within your organization. Because if you have an executive committee, it could be you have diversity on your board, but if you don't have a lot of diversity among your officers, it could put a stunt, it could bottleneck any growth towards diversity within the organization. Okay, so this is where you want to ask yourself and your organization, what is in the best interest of our board? What are we doing to protect ourselves as fiduciaries? And that's how you can position the question. You notice a lot of these questions don't have a lot to do with diversity from the verbiage, but they have everything to do about diversity from the implementation. Because when you're asking what is in the best interest of the board, it then no longer becomes about, oh, we need to have this much representation here in certain areas, although those conversations will come up. It's about, this is in the best interest of our board as a whole, because we have this gap between who we represent and how we're made up. And so because of that, we need to protect ourselves as fiduciaries. If we don't connect those dots, we're putting ourselves at risk as a board. If you don't diversify, you're automatically increasing your risk is how you function as a board. And sometimes when you word it in such a way that makes that connection clear, there's more flexibility and openness to diversification. Okay, so here are some of the practices. I actually did a dissertation between an all-white organization and an all-black organization, and I found very specific themes that were intentional, that unified mindset. So I want to go through those. Storytelling, so important to tell stories. If you have clients, you need to, and even staff members, give them 5 minutes in a board meeting to tell a story about how your organization has impacted a certain people group and how you could better impact that. Highlight those things where you have seen diversity and cross intercultural communication happen that can really increase the desire to go in that direction. Demographic tours. I am a huge fan. I have taken hundreds of people of all ethnic groups and backgrounds on demographic tours of my community. No matter what you do as a nonprofit board, whether it's a location tour or a demographic tour of your community, people can't argue with what they see firsthand. They cannot, they can't write off. Exposure is, and we'll talk about that more in a second, seeing with your own eyes things in the community. It helps people connect the dots. It helps things click in their head. You know, so many times we serve on nonprofit boards, but we're in our own little bubble in our own little world, and we're not strongly enough in touch with who's being served by our nonprofit. So creating a space for intentionally doing a tour demographically of who you serve. Acknowledgement develops trust. One of the things I realized, so I did this whole entire study, and it was based on a demographic tour. We never brought up race, ever, except for to say the racial makeup of the community. That's the only time we brought up race. And when we debriefed and did focus groups, the number one topic of dialogue was race. Because people then felt comfortable discussing race. And what we realized is when people acknowledged other people's feelings, it developed trust to have those safe, they felt like they were in a place to have those conversations, and they felt acknowledged. And those acknowledgments will look different. Like my African American organization, they wanted to know that the white organization was making it a priority. The Caucasian organization wanted to know that the African American organization was, and priority for the African American organization meant that they were putting the money where their mouth was, that they were actually investing in it financially. For the Caucasian organization, they wanted to know that the African American or the Black organization was showing up. So there was different needs for both of them to understand and build trust, but just the acknowledgement of the differences of what the different people groups needed. Okay, the next one was shared stats. Again, when we shared statistics, you can't argue with numbers, right? When you're sharing good, factual, baseline, foundational statistics, it breeds this point of being able to address a reality, and everyone's working from the same facts. Okay, let me get, for some reason I'm stuck again. Hold on. Okay, connecting the dots. A lot of times when you're working with a board, you have to verbally just connect the dots for them. I'll give examples for that a little in my next slide, but you have to walk them through. Hey, if we do this now, 5 years from now, this is what we could look like and accomplish. 10 years from now, this is what you got to show how what the movement towards diversity now can impact the organization for the good 5 years from now, 10 years from now, even the more immediate future of a year from now. You have to help people gain new contextual perspective. That has a lot to do with proximity and the openness of discussion in a boardroom. Visual exposure. I would say this is, besides one more point I'm going to make, and the rest of these points, visual exposure was the number one. I found that a lot of people don't even know certain things exist in the community, whether it's the low income, whether it's different religious groups. And if they're exposed to it, it then becomes an understanding within their proximity of reality. Pursue a preferred future. So always leading the conversation with, this is where we want to be. This is where we want to go with our vision and mission. It's not about just fulfilling what feels good now. It's about doing what's best for us in the future. Focus on humanity. Sorry for the pun here. It trumps culture. One of the places we stopped on our demographic tour was a WIC clinic. I thought it was going to be the most highly charged stop that we did. We stopped at human trafficking, education, but WIC clinic, because a lot of immigrants were using and are predominantly majority dominated community was being used by our minorities. But when we put humanity around what WIC was for, why it was there, boy, that it became the least charged in the area that most people had concerns around and remembered. And it's because we put the humanity piece into who we were serving. We didn't focus on how different they were. We focused on what their needs were and being humans, how we were going to meet those needs. Guided risk. This is the other thing that is so, so important. I have found, especially for Caucasians, now hear me out. If you provide a setting that you are very clear, this is a learning environment, and here are some of the things we're going to discuss. That of the things, the questions that came out of people's mouths between the white group and the black group, the two people groups, were amazing. The kind of things they would never ask because they understood it as a learning environment. They felt more comfortable and safe asking things that they probably wouldn't ever ask. And some of the things, honestly, I would hear a Caucasian ask an African American and I would cringe. I would be like, oh my gosh. But the funny thing is, because it was in that environment, there was this sense of, oh, they must not really understand my cultural struggle. And they were willing to listen and hear the other person out. Whereas in another setting, it may be a hardly charged conversation. It took all the emotional charge out of it to where it was a learning environment. So treat your board meetings and your board interactions as a learning environment and set it up that way verbally. Collaborations, collaborating with other groups within your community that may not have the same makeup as you, so you can understand and learn from other people groups. Intentionality, again, that kind of speaks for itself, to be intentional about this whole process. Emotional impact, realize that, yes, we all know this. People, when they sometimes, obviously they're dealing with shame and guilt and whatever, but make it about, look, this is beyond the emotional impact to really incorporate change within the organization. Then having a shared environment, I'm going to talk a little more about that on the next slide, but proximity and environment are so important. Making sure people in your board have times of sharing and communication outside of board meetings. Now, not inappropriately, we'll get to that in a second. Then use all these things as building blocks. Build on one thing over the other. Keep building on how to diversify. And then, like I talked about, the emphasis on race. I have been in plenty of settings where I don't bring up race, but it comes up naturally, and we're able to talk about it very clearly and very much in a way that it's just a normal part of the conversation rather than a charged issue. Okay, so one of the things here I want to talk about is these are practical strategies you can use to diversify on your board. Best gift, I've had several board members pull me aside and say, look, our board requires that we do this, this, and this, or give this amount. And I just don't have it, because you're dealing with different socioeconomic statuses. And if you want someone from the underrepresented group to have a seat at the table, but this is where in your letter of intent or in what they give each year, you can emphasize other things. They're making connections. They're committing to making connections. They're committing to, yes, maybe a financial gift, because that's important, but how does that look? That can look different for every person, but you're emphasizing giving your best gift, whether that's hosting meetings in your homes for potential donors, whether that's making connections with the people groups you're serving in a way that you wouldn't be able to as an organization. Okay, appreciative inquiry. I want to talk about that a little bit. This is a term used in community development that you're listening to their community and what they need, and you're engaging them in the process. That is turning your board towards a mindset that they are there for the community, and there has to be a component on the board where the community is being listened to as they're doing strategic plans and building the nonprofit. Now, whether this is representation on the board, which I always recommend of community members that you're serving or have been served in the past by your nonprofit, or whether that is going out before you start a program, before you start something, and make sure you're really listening to what the community needs. Because most of our under-resourced communities lack tools and resources. They know the solution. They know what needs to happen in their community. We can't be so presumptuous that we think that we have a better solution than they do. But going and listening to them and engaging them in the process, whether it's on these committees, on a task force, making sure we engage the community in some way by listening to them. Having equitable seats on board and advisory council. Again, this is when you look at your stats of who you're serving versus who your board's made up of. If there's a disparity there, then your board really does need to say, look, if we have 30% Hispanics we're serving and 40% Asians, then where is that representation on our board? I mean, being very blunt. Yes.
Dr. We're approaching the top of the hour.
Okay. I have one more slide after this that we can do. Clear goals and purposes in your marketing and vetting of new board members. That means being clear about where you're going to go to different groups, different social groups, different minority groups to actually market that you need board members and advisor council members. Methods of dispensing board recruiting. Highlight how you're addressing diversity on your social media, your website, and within professional groups. Making sure you have client representation. Onboarding and orientation. Again, another very practical way. Exposure to potential board members. Going into those networks. Having board members go on interviews with potential board members to expose them to how qualified minority groups are to serve on the board. Because a lot of times there's this misconception about how qualified they are to be a part of the board. Board binders. There needs to be visual representation and statistics in your board binders so they understand constantly what's in front of them. Strategic dialogue, meaning not outside a board meeting. You don't want people to start dialogue. Everything that needs to be discussed needs to happen in a board meeting. You don't want side conversations to create dissension, but making sure that there's strategic dialogue. Community history, educating your board on your community history, and shared meals. Statistics show if you do 2.5 hours every year beyond board meetings of shared time with board members, your productivity increases by like 80%. Okay, this is the last thing I want to share because I'm going to send this out and you'll have the opportunity to see this later. I do what's called a board recruitment matrix in my board workshops. And that is getting people, you'll see at the top where you can put the name, and I will make sure that this gets distributed to y'all. You can customize it for how you want. You put the name of the board member, and then you have them fill out either in a board workshop setting or in an individual setting, and it will show the board clearly where the gaps are on paper without personal bias or personal preferences. Here is the gaps that we need to fill in order for our board to reach its mission and vision. A lot of times, what that reveals is an age disparity, a racial disparity, a professional disparity, and then you can go from there. Then it becomes about this is what we need to do for the organization and not the personal preferences or ideas. And discussing how can we best implement practices for implementation. Let me go down to Q&A. The slide before that was simply, this is a great book, the Nonprofit Board Answer Book, also put out by Board Source. Because I'm telling you, I know you probably feel like I spent a lot of times on logistics and structure, but I'm telling you, you address those things, the open opportunity. For instance, I worked with a board. It was a soccer organization, all white men on the board. And I'm like, who are your soccer players that you're representing? They were all Hispanic and under-resourced kids. I was like, where are your Blacks and Hispanics on your board? You're not going to be effective at reaching the people groups you say you're here to serve unless you put that representation on your board and on your staff. And it did. It shifted. Once we walked through those logistics and what their responsibilities were, it takes away it makes the opinions agnostic, and it makes what's best for the organization and the people you serve and fulfilling the mission and vision and core values top of mind. Okay, I'm sorry. I know that was a lot. I know we got started late. Are there any Q&A?
There were only a couple of comments early on. Lexi
Okay.
had, and when Lexi initially said that she was basically, I think she identifies as white. She didn't say, she just said she was non-black, but they were trying to change the composition of the board. I thought there might have been an opportunity to address. And then I had a question for you, because you mentioned cultural competence.
Yes.
But I would an explanation of maybe what those terms are, because a lot of people believe they know. But I think the comment, well, the question I had was, how do you communicate, or can you share what you mean by interculturally competent?
Well, interculturally competent it's more of a reciprocated process. We're here to learn from each other. I want to learn about your culture, you want to learn about my culture. Not that my culture is right and I need you to adapt to my culture, right? It's more of this understanding. And I got to be just very blunt here. For white people, a lot of times that means they feel like they're giving up their identity. I mean, they feel threatened, right? Like if I learn more about your culture, that means that my expectation is that I have to change who I am, both as a person and my cultural context. Now, that may naturally change, like mine has drastically naturally changed. But when you engage on a cultural competence level, you're not feeling threatened by another people group. You don't feel threatened or attacked or like that you have to be on the defensive. It is simply, I want to know more about your culture and more about your perspective, knowing that we're trying to reach this goal. How can we have conversations that take us that, yes, very much respects and has dialogue about those things, but takes us to a place where there's a mutual understanding or a mutual way of addressing something that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be prejudiced or biased or racist.
Yeah. I don't see any other questions. Love the information. I'm eager to get that, especially that last matrix that you created. That would probably be
Yes.
a very critical tool for diversifying a board by saying what is required and what is lacking on many boards. So,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yes.
I don't see any questions. So
Okay, well, thank y'all for your time today. Again, sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning. I know it was a lot of information, but hopefully as you review it and look at it, I know there will be a recording posted later. You're able to use some of these, again, what's going to give you the most credence to have a voice on a board is knowing facts about best practices and how boards should function. And then people start realizing you know what you're talking about. And hopefully that opens doors that wouldn't have been opened before.
all right.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lee. I'll be sending
Thank you,
that
Dr. Nichols.
matrix to Amber.
Fantastic.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.